Thanks for tuning in to the Global Novel. I'm Claire Hennessy. Mulan is a legendary folk heroine from the northern and southern dynasties era of Chinese history, roughly from 4th to 6th century CE. The story of Mulan was originally told in the Ballad of Mulan as a Yuefu genre, in which Chinese poems were composed in a folk song style. Over the centuries, the story of Mulan has been reiterated, being performed on the stage, adapted for the screen, and rewritten as dramas for television and even animated films. Joining us today is Dr. Shiamin Kwa, Associate Professor of East Asian Languages and Cultures and Comparative Literature at Bryn Mawr College. Among her expertise ranging from graphic narratives to Chinese literature, she is best known for her book with Wilt Idema titled Mulan, Five Versions of a Classic Chinese Legend. Welcome, Xiamin, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so what inspired you to put together these five different versions of Mulan? Why these choices in particular?
So the project came together, or rather, I came to the project um, because of my PhD advisor and mentor, Wilt Idema, who was my dissertation advisor at Harvard. He was editing a series of books about traditional tales in China, and one of the books that he selected to focus on was going to be about Mulan. And because I had written one of my chapters of my dissertation, which was on the playwright Xu Wei, one of the plays that he wrote was about Mulan. It was called The Female Mulan. He asked me if I would take on this volume. Um, Sort of on an anecdotal level, it was a bit of a perfect request at the time because I was at myself a bit of a crossroads in terms of social roles. I was a new parent, and I wasn't sure if I could balance being a mother and being a professional. And it seemed to me that those anxieties in 2010 were the same kinds of problems that Mulan herself encountered as a woman and as a professional, if you can call it that. So I sort of, I really embraced that idea. And because we knew that we wanted to start with the earliest iterations
Mhm.
of the story, we wanted to include, of course, the first two poems,
Mhm.
and then thought of the Shu Wei play as a midpoint chronologically in terms of how we were putting the book together. And then we wanted to include two Chinese versions from the 20th century. So we picked Peking opera text and the film screenplay to kind of round it out and to talk about the ways that even before it came into America, it was already transforming and having different perspectives, different emphases over time.
Right, interesting. What are the key rhetorics of the poem that you think are important for us to learn about today?
Well, I mean, I think one of the reasons that Mulan is so elastic, I guess, is that
Right.
one of the most obvious things about it is this idea about gender, right? How much of gender is indicative of what we're capable of doing or not, and how much of that is socially constructed. And besides that, however, I think that it speaks to essential questions about identity in general, and it questions the roles that children have in relationship to their parents. Sometimes in versions, who's responsible among siblings in a family. And of course, questions, especially when we're looking in the 20th century, questions of patriotism and national or ethnic identity, political affiliations, and in many ways, this story speaks to all of those questions about where we see ourselves and how other people see us.
Right. Well, many readers find it unbelievable and unconvincing almost that Mulan has never been discovered as a woman during her
Mm.
12 years of serving as an army soldier. This may be one of the reasons that led many ensuing writers or playwrights to supplement additional details to the original narrative. Could you please walk us through the major narratorial and rhetorical shifts that might have provided some explanations, either
Mm.
for this particular dubiosity or just as a matter of overall evolutionary process?
Sure. I mean, I think from a formal perspective, it is the case that, with a poem in which I should backtrack a little bit and say that
Sure.
in the poem, there isn't as much an emphasis on how she went through the 12 years. I mean, there's definitely an expression of surprise, right? With the
Mhm.
fellow soldiers comment on how could we have not known? And in fact, Mulan ends the poem by saying, when two rabbits are running next to each other, you can't tell which one is male and which one is
Right.
female. And that's sort of, the end
Mhm.
of the discussion about it. When we get to versions that are plays, now you have the author having to deal with the reality of having a physical body on stage, and the whole audience is looking at this person, whether it's played by the character's played by a male actor or a female actor. It changes how the audience themselves react to it, and so the play tries to deal with the confusion or the doubt, and comes about this in a variety of ways. I think often it ends up pointing to the way that costume, the way that we dress ourselves, is the first surface detail that most people rely on in terms of judging what they think they see. And so, in the case of the Shu Wei play, there are a few situations in which Mulan has to hide her female body.
Mhm.
And so, in the case of Mulan in the Shu Wei play, it's the bound feet, which is really interesting, right? Because
Yes.
you could bind a boy's feet, and I'm not suggesting that you do, but that's actually an externally imposed
Mhm.
gender distinction, and yet that's her biggest concern, right? That someone could see that she has these bound feet, and so in the play they introduce a special powder that she can apply to her feet that helps make them expand again, and then another powder that helps them shrink back when she goes back to being a girl. And then, of course, the other issue is going to the bathroom in public, or bathing, right?
That's right.
So
I've been always wondering that part since a child.
so
Right.
in the case of the Shui play, she just says, I have to make sure I never go to the bathroom in front of anybody, and apparently she succeeds for 12 years. I guess you can imagine it's relatable to when you're an undergraduate in a dorm and you don't want to share a bathroom with 12 other people. But that's sort of how they deal with it. And in the film version, they have a similar situation where she refuses to wash her feet in front of the other people, and that could serve as maybe a metonym for any other kind of nakedness
Hmm.
in that context. But yes, you're right. It is mysterious,
Hmm.
and they some versions kind of bend over backwards to at least address it, although they don't go into that much detail about how indeed she hides it for this amount of time.
Very interesting. What can we learn about women's status and the social expectations of a woman from Mulan's cross-dressing?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question, and I'd like I I'd like to propose a bit of a thought experiment, if you will, to think about what it suggests about social expectations.
Mhm.
If you can imagine that there's a village that is under threat of some kind, but that the threat is this, right? A messenger comes from the emperor, and the messenger says, the nation is really in peril. There are these barbarians. They're coming from north, south, east, or west, and they say that we're going to be doomed unless we're able to produce 12 million yards of fabric, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And if we don't do that, we'll all be doomed. And so we need all of the daughters of the village to go to their looms and start weaving. And in a certain family, say we'll call it the Hua family,
All right.
there's only a son, and his mother's too old to weave, so he puts on a dress and he hurries to the loom and he produces textiles, and he
Mhm.
produces so much textiles that the emperor is so impressed and rewards him. And then he says, actually, I'm a man, and I'm going to go feed the horses, right? When
Right.
you put it in that context, you start to think, well, why don't I want to watch that movie? Right?
Right.
Like, why is that not interesting? And that then raises these questions about why it would be so fantastical
Mhm.
or absurd or unbelievable that a woman dressing up as a man and going to battle
Mhm.
is heroic and courageous and self sacrificing and
Right.
brave, whereas we don't have those prejudices against a man, right? We kind of take it as a baseline that everyone can weave.
Mhm.
And even if we have the same stakes, right? Even if we say,
Right.
oh, the nation's going to fall apart, maybe
Mhm.
it'll be economic devastation.
Right.
There isn't really a parallel, and so I think it suggests that in the various versions that we see, uh, a lower expectation of
Mhm.
what women are capable of, or expected
Mhm.
from, and what that means to each individual writer is different each time, and they have their own versions of it. But I do think, like I said, I would like to imagine a world where the reverse story was in play as well.
Right. Well, speaking of a lower expectation of women, I wonder how can a poem written by a minor ethnicity that endorsed the
Mm.
women's success in their society survive the censorship of Confucianism, which was the dominant ideology of the Chinese Han culture and which literally looked down upon women? In other words,
Mm.
how did the Ballad of Mulan even get assimilated into the Han culture?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Hmm. Well, I mean, I a couple of things. I think one of the problems about um, about this, our lack of knowledge really about the authorship of this poem is we don't quite know, right, whether this was uh, an ethnic minority writing this poem,
Hmm.
or if it was a Han majority, author writing in the voice of a ethnic minority perspective. But you're right that it does take on this set of social roles and ideas about uh, people on the margin, whether it's because of gender or
Hmm.
ethnicity, as central. And I suppose even in that case, it's hard to know what the significance is of that in the sense that you know we find out time and time again in our own society as well
Hmm.
that you can be entertained by and even hold up as a hero a person of a marginalized or minority status, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your society is welcoming of and tolerant of that minority perspective, right? That it can be an entertainment and it can even be a heroic symbol
Hmm.
when it's within the realm of fiction.
Yeah. Oh.
But unfortunately, maybe not always in the real world.
Oh, that's right. In Xu Wei's version, according to what you wrote, that for the first
Mm-hmm.
time, the author highlighted that Mulan's surname is Hua. It's interesting
Mm,
because Hua is not a Chinese Han name, and therefore this sort of indicated Mulan's ethnicity as
mm-hmm.
non-Han.
Mm-hmm.
How does this subtle detail help us understand the role of gender in Mulan's own ethnic culture, and how is it different from the dominant Han culture?
Um, I suppose in many ways it it could highlight a number of things. It could highlight
Yeah.
that we're not talking about a historic person as much as we are a symbolic
Hmm.
entity, right? That a person with a name that suggests somehow difference has a little bit more freedom or flexibility to do things that challenge the social order. And I think that maybe that's part of what makes it so entertaining, what makes her seem exceptional without, as you've suggested, really threatening the social order, right? That you don't have so many little girls necessarily also deciding to do this, and instead having her as an isolated, one of a kind
Right.
character who does these things because nobody else can.
That's right. Well, gender and ethnicity, as you just pointed out, have always been an informing yet vexed issue when we contemplate Mulan as a narrative discourse. Given that Mulan assumes a different identity every time on paper or on stage, some critics viewed it as cultural appropriation. So, what do you think of these criticisms?
I kind of I think it's ironic, really, in the context of Mulan, the character, because for me, the thing that is most striking about Mulan in really all of her appearances in these various plays and poems and films is that she's trying to make a point about how she looks is the least important thing about who she is, right? And
Right.
that it's her actions that she wants to have in the limelight, and to some extent even in certain versions of the Mulan story, including the Shu Wei play, she really says this is not about me. This is about this person who did these actions. And so to me, to to think about her as needing to represent a larger population or a larger group, when in fact what she's saying is that she resists this idea of being judged by a single perspective. I think maybe she would resist that interpretation as well. I think she's hardly willing to just sit back and let other people tell her how they want her to be.
Right. Well, even though these different versions carry different social and historical connotations, in your opinion, what should deserve our appreciation of these adaptations, or what should be commonly shared with Mulan's story? And finally, what makes a certain narrative like Mulan's transcend time, space, and cultural
Mm.
borders?
That's a great question. I think what makes her so attractive to readers and audiences over centuries is precisely this question of knowing who you are, right? And be whatever situation or particular perspective a person is coming from. We've all experienced a situation where we know what we're capable of, and in whatever case it is, other people don't, right? And they
Right.
assume that we can't do it, whether it's because we're a woman, whether it's because we're too young, whether it's because we're a minority, whatever it is,
Mhm.
there is always uh, this barrier, I think, between who we know ourselves to be and how other people see us. And Mulan, I think, is so attractive to us because she says, I don't care. She says, I'm going to be who I know myself to be.
Mhm.
And it's not that she's naive about the social situation that she's entering, right? She knows that if she wants to take her father's place, she has to put on the armor, she has to pretend she's a man. It doesn't change what she's capable of. But it's a really interesting balance, I think, between this incredible confidence and an incredible sort of practical awareness of the world that she has to deal with, right? And
Right.
and it's, I think, really empowering to have somebody like that who, for all of us, right, who says, look, the world is a bit of a mess. People have all of these prejudices, they have all these biases, but we don't have to be passive and accept it. And I find that the most remarkable thing about her, and I think that is why people keep returning to her and seeing in her a narrative that they can identify with in all kinds of really interesting ways.
Fabulous. Thank you for the wonderful insights on Mulan that you've shared with us today.
Oh, of course, it was a pleasure.